Welcome back to Senate Education on Thursday, February 10th. Ms. Siglowski, my apologies for running over and running late. I know you're busy and want to be respectful of your time, but we appreciate you being here. And again, my apologies. We are talking about, first with you, if you'd be so kind, S-139, Act relating to public school team mascots, and wondering if the School Board Association would be so kind as to weigh in on this.
We would be happy to. For the record, I'm Sue Siglowski, Executive Director of the Vermont School Boards Association, here on S-139, the mascot bill. The VSBA board held its monthly meeting last night, February 9th, and prior to the meeting, the board members reviewed the following documents in preparation for their discussion. They looked at S-139 as introduced, version 1.1, the summary of mascot laws in other states that was prepared by your legislative council, the state board chair, Oliver Olson's slide presentation on school branding, and then they also reviewed the February 8th video of both Chief Don Stevens' testimony and Chair Olson's testimony to your committee.
Oh, thank you.
And after a vigorous and very thoughtful discussion, the board passed the following motion regarding Chair Olson's presentation, with all attending members voting yes, except for one abstention. The VSBA believes a public school or an independent school receiving public funds shall not have, adopt, or retain a name, symbol, or image that depicts or refers to a racial or ethnic group, individual, custom, or tradition, and that is used as a mascot, nickname, logo, letterhead, or team name of the school. The VSBA does not support the proposed role of the State Board of Education. So that's the motion that passed. And some points I think that can be gleaned from the motion and the board's discussion is they definitely believe that this should be that there should be a state level solution to the mascot issue. They believe that the solution should be developed by the legislature, their elected representatives, and should not involve the State Board of Education, who are appointed. The solution should apply to both public schools and independent schools that are approved to receive public tuition, and should also consider the impact of mascots and imagery for all racial and ethnic groups, individuals, customs, and traditions. And finally, if there is a body responsible for developing guidelines and or rules or for being involved in this process about school mascots, they believe that its composition should be diverse and inclusive. So that is that's what they decided last night. And I would just also note that the language, I've submitted written testimony, so you'll have the language from the motion. It actually really tracks the language that is in S-139 as introduced. I think it's quite close to what is actually in S-139 as introduced, minus the part at the end that talked about not allowing students to participate in VPA events if the school hadn't addressed it after 3 years. So they did not include that part. They didn't think that it was a good idea to sort of penalize students for decisions that they did not make. So that concludes my testimony on the mascot.
That's very helpful. Thank you. You know, the state board situation, it's an interesting one. And Ms. Dow, as you may have heard earlier, also raised, it's an unelected body. Should this go to perhaps AOE? But correct me if I'm wrong, you're thinking it shouldn't. So what I think one of the things we're trying to get at, and this might be a better way to ask it, is, all right, so what if there should be some kind of, this isn't the right word, but complaint process, even in a decade or 2 decades from now, if a mascot changes, there should be some kind of organization or group of people that you can say, this is inappropriate, we want it changed, recognizing, as the School Board Association said last night, remove it from the local level. So can you help me just think about how that might work? You know what you know what we're trying to do here. And I know it's not exactly what School Board Association wants, but I still like the idea of people being able to go to the state board and file a complaint, if you will, or go to some organization and say, hey, you know, it's now 2050, and what we put forward back in 2022 isn't, you know, it's not, things have changed, and, you know, can you, you know, help us push for that change? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand the concern, and that's something that they talked about a little bit last night.
Okay.
Actually, quite a bit. They weren't able to really come up with a process that was kind of beyond the scope of what they needed to do and the amount of time that they had, I think.
Sure.
But it's definitely, you know, something to be considered. It might help to take a look, and I'd be happy to do this at some of. It was great to have your legislative council prepare that list of what's happening in other states, and maybe there's an example of a way to approach it that another state has identified.
Yeah. Okay, questions for Ms. Siglowski? Senator Chinden?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Ms. Siglowski, I guess I'm trying to understand better the last sentence in the motion. The VSBA does not support the proposed role of the State Board of Education. Is there a history as to where the hesitation is? Because simultaneously say there should be a state level solution. I guess I'm just not understanding or reconciling the difference between the two. You just don't like the process going through the board, but you want a hard and fast law in place preventing certain mascots?
Yes, I think that summarizes it.
But what it doesn't that sort of put, so if we say, oh, I think the original version of this bill said, all right, you've got a couple of years to sort of fix it. So what happens if they don't fix it? This is where we thought the state board could, you know, we could create incentives, or we could ask them to create a mascot. So what if in 10 years, still nothing's happened? And I know I'm asking a lot. I know I'm asking you to to sort of summarize and kind of just work with us here on what was discussed, but help us out here, Sue, for God's sakes, please.
I will try. So you certainly could put a deadline in the bill. That was actually you had a deadline in the original bill. But I guess we need to think a little bit more about what happens if the deadline isn't met.
Okay. Any other questions for Ms. Siglowski? Ms. Siglowski, any other comments for us at this point before we move on?
Not on this topic.
Okay, thank you very much. And if you can give it some additional thought for the additional leadership of the VSBA, we would really appreciate it.
Yes, we will do that.
Great. S-162, an act relating to collective bargaining rights of teachers. Senators will recall, and others watching, that we worked on this yesterday for a while. And I apologize again for scheduling. We asked that Ms. Siglowski and Mr. Fannin come in today since we didn't have time to get to them. So with that, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you this afternoon to provide testimony on S-162. And having spent some time in your committee, I know how much you appreciate hearing from boots on the ground. Yesterday, you heard testimony, and I had the opportunity to hear it as well, from 3 superintendents and 2 principals, each of whom expressed significant concerns with the bill. And these are the people with the boots on the ground running our schools. They spoke persuasively, to me at least, about the upheaval that this bill would create in the months of May and June, just as districts are working to close out the school year, and the damage it would do to the stability of the learning environment, particularly for those school systems that historically have operated with fewer resources or in more rural and remote areas of Vermont. As executive director of the Vermont School Boards Association, and with a membership whose volunteer elected positions place them in roles where they must be concerned about stability within the school system and stability for the learning process, I'm very concerned about this bill. While neither Mr. Fannin of the Vermont NEA nor I had the opportunity to testify yesterday, I have been able to review Mr. Fannin's testimony, and not surprisingly, I have some contrary views. First, it is worth noting that in Mr. Fannin's testimony, there is no data to support the arguments made. He cited some anecdotes regarding experiences of union members, but there was no data provided about the number of cases or incidents to support the position in his testimony. And I'd also note that his testimony centered on the ability to interview for positions and not about the consequences and effects that arise when a teacher is hired and leaves the school district with which they have the contract in place. A central theme of the Vermont NEA testimony was the special circumstances that teachers face in terms of being the only profession that does not enjoy the opportunity to interview for other positions while employed. That may be the case, but it is also the case that no other profession enjoys the protections that teachers enjoy under their collectively bargained agreements and under state statutes. Requiring a teacher under contract to fulfill that contract is a basic trade-off for the expansive scope of rights and protections they have under collectively bargained agreements and state statutes. It also takes into account the interests of students. So in my view, the status of teacher employment needs to be looked at on balance, disadvantages and advantages, not simply in this case in terms of disadvantages, which, by the way, were responded to by the administrators who spoke in terms of the accommodations that are offered to teachers seeking to change employment. Admittedly, those explanations were based on a representative sample, but the sentiments about responsible actions by administrators on behalf of teachers were very sincere and seemingly are as valid as Mr. Fannin's examples. I want to speak for a moment about the current conditions facing school districts. This committee has focused, and very justifiably, on the worker shortage and current conditions facing school personnel at every level. And we very much appreciate your focus on that. In VSBA's view, the enactment of S-162, irrespective of the implementation date, would make matters with respect to worker shortage worse and not better. This would largely affect districts that have historically had to contend with more, not fewer, challenges. The provisions outlined in S-162 would have created serious challenges 5 years ago. Today, and for the foreseeable future, those challenges are going to be much greater. If this bill goes into effect, it will not be the better resource districts in the centers of population that will be challenged. It will be districts that are facing greater challenges already, the very districts about which we are the most concerned. With respect to the provision offering protections against discipline for a teacher who testifies before the General Assembly or the state board, it is my belief that this is unnecessary, also relies on anecdote, and worse, creates imagery around this bill that is intended to cast school boards in a negative light when considering the other provisions of the bill. The reality for school boards is that they hear all kinds of feedback, negative, neutral, and positive from teachers. Teachers locally have strong representation from the Vermont NEA, which often organizes them to testify on a variety of settings without apparent fear of reprisal. This provision is not necessary. To conclude, I have seen this committee be student-focused in its discussion of other bills, and students should be at the heart of your decision-making as the Senate Education Committee. Please keep in the forefront of your minds the destabilizing effects of this bill on the operation of schools. Destabilizing school operations has a direct impact on the quality of instruction for students. For all of the reasons that I have spoken of, VSBA does not support S-162. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zagłowski. Questions or comments at this point for Ms. Zagłowski? Senator Perchlik.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, Ms. Zagłowski, do you know of any other union members that also have collective bargaining that have this condition that they have to ask permission from their employer to go interview for another job? For example, police officers, they perform a critical role. They're often represented by unions, but I don't think they have to get permission to go apply for a police position in another town.
So Senator Perchlik, I'm not sure of the specifics on police officers, but I would say even if this is the only group that has this requirement, this is also the only group that has the significant statutory protections that are in place, as well as their collective bargaining agreement.
What statutory protections are you referring to?
I'm talking about the ones that are you can see them in the bill because this bill modifies some of them. 1752.
That lays out the bargaining process and all that. Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments for Ms. Zagłowski? So maybe help me understand this a little bit, because I think others have talked about the destabilizing. We're talking, and we're just talking about teachers that would want to move from one school to another school, but we're still talking within the state of Vermont. So it would be a teacher that might go to another school because it's, again, closer to a spouse, closer to their home, closer to where their kids, all sorts of reasons. So it's destabilizing, but also maybe helping out another school. That would be accurate, correct, Ms. Zagłowski?
Well, what we see often is that the smaller, more rural districts are the training grounds for teachers, and some of the larger, more, if you can use the word urban in Vermont, districts won't hire a teacher unless they have some experience. And so what happens is that there's movement from the smaller, more rural, less resource districts to the more resource districts. That's typically what you'll see.
That does strike me, if I may, as quite anecdotal. And I would appreciate, do you have some research on that you could share with us? Because and again, this comment is anecdotal. I know people that go to rural communities because they really want to live in rural communities. They want to, they want to be right there. They want to, they don't want to travel too far. So they might want to, that's going to be their space. So do you have some research that you could share with us that would show that people are leaving rural communities in this state and moving to urban communities?
I do have some data regarding a district that is a more rural district and how many educators they're losing on an annual basis. I don't necessarily know exactly where each one of their employees went when they left.
I do want to hesitate, I hesitate, and you were the one who rightfully raised the good point. I don't want things completely to be based on anecdotal comments. I'd feel much more comfortable if there were some evidence showing that there was a mass exodus of our rural communities into Burlington, Bennington, Rutland, areas like that. Senator Perchlik.
Well, even if there was, this bill isn't going to affect that. I mean, it's not preventing them from going to take another job in an urban area. It just provides them what I would consider just kind of basic rights of an employee to go interview for another job without having to ask your current employer for permission to do so. So they may or may not be doing that, but it's kind of irrelevant. I think it's a concern about under-resourced schools being able to retain the best teachers. I think the best teachers should be rewarded and be able to go to the higher paying jobs. We want them to have that incentive. So we don't want them to feel like, well, it doesn't matter, I'm trapped here anyway. You want them to say, like, I'm going to be the best teacher so I can get that better job. But the problem of under-resourced schools isn't solved by giving the employers more power to keep good employees there. It's by giving them more resources or trying to equalize it another way. So I agree it's a problem. I just don't think this is a solution to that problem.
Other questions or comments for Ms. Zagłowski? Ms. Zagłowski, feel free to stay with us. We're going to now shift to Mr. Fannin.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to discuss with you S-162. The bill is important to Vermont EA's members, and I'll explain why. The bill addresses 3 teacher labor and employment issues. Together, they are miscellaneous, perhaps, changes, but they're important to the teacher workforce, and these changes are about basic fairness in the employment of teachers. Specifically, how we allow teachers to seek new teaching assignments, how teachers in schools process disciplinary matters, and whether teachers can speak to policymakers without fear of discipline. Section 1 would allow teachers to enjoy the right that all employees enjoy, specifically the right to interview for another teaching position. Unlike any other profession, the current system prohibits teachers from interviewing for another teaching job without first quitting her current teaching position. For most teachers, the risk of quitting one's job in hopes of getting an interview for another position is just too great. And therefore, most teachers don't seek employment elsewhere, even if they have good reasons for becoming employed in another school district in Vermont. The problem is not new, but has become more acute, and teachers are increasingly upset with how they are treated. No other profession in the public or private sector is required to get permission from, no other professional in a public or private setting is required to get permission from a boss to interview for a new position. The bill creates a modest 2-month hiring season wherein teachers can interview for a new teaching position and schools could seek new teachers to fill a vacancy. H80, the House companion bill, allows teachers to change jobs until the school year begins. In contrast, S-162 gives teachers a modest and a reasonable amount of flexibility to interview for a new teaching position, while also ensuring school districts have teachers under contract in time for the beginning of the next school year. The argument that the bill would harm rural schools, as you were just discussing, and goes about solving the problem in the wrong way. We want to attract and retain teachers to rural schools and by making sure that they have the resources and the supports to stay where they are, not artificially keeping them attached to that job. The problem is not just one of urban versus rural divide. Indeed, prior to becoming the executive director at Vermont EA, I was general counsel. And in that position annually, I heard from teachers who asked me what they could do to stop their superintendent from blocking them for interviewing from another district. In my memory, the most notable example involved a math teacher trying to leave Chittenden County, i.e. the higher paying county, to teach in the Upper Valley. She wanted to leave a higher paying position. Her reasons for wanting to do so were familial. Her husband had accepted a job, I think, at Dartmouth. Her then superintendent blocked her from interviewing from 3 Upper Valley school districts. He contacted the superintendents in those 3 districts and said she was under contract and could not interview for the openings. In that case, all 3 Upper Valley superintendents agreed and did not grant her an interview. Ultimately, she quit her job in the summer and accepted a new position that was only 50 miles away from her family. This made no sense then, and it still happens today. And this is not a one-off scenario or even a contested matter. Superintendents have told teachers and Vermont EA that they have agreed amongst themselves to prohibit teachers from interviewing for another position while under contract at any time. This is not a good system and needs to be fixed. S-162 would fix this problem for both sides and allow teachers to change jobs without resorting to quitting first and hoping for a new job later. The second proposed amendment, found at section 1752B and C, addresses a Vermont Supreme Court decision. In that decision, Northfield v. Washington South Education Association, the court said that because the way the law is written, teachers and school boards must adhere to a restrictive 15-day timeline when processing a teacher's challenge to her suspension or discharge. For years, local unions and school boards essentially ignored that 15-day timeline and instead followed the timeline in their collective bargaining agreements. The amendment here that we're seeking allows school boards and local teacher unions to do what they did for years, follow their contractually agreed upon timelines in which to file a grievance and hear that matter, and then not unnecessarily adhering to an overly restrictive statutory timeline. The change would protect both parties and to their right of contract. Third, and perhaps this goes to the first issue as well, the third change to 162 seeks to add subsection F to protect teachers who testify before the legislature, a legislative committee, or the State Board of Education. We have heard from teachers who have been retaliated against for appearing here or at the State Board of Education and speaking up about educational matters. That is wrong and should be prohibited. The amendment would make clear that a teacher may appear and give testimony without fear of losing her job or suffering any form of discipline. And those are all my written comments. I would like to respond to a few of the comments from yesterday, if I may. Mark Tucker, the superintendent at Caledonia Cooperative, I believe it is, talked about 17. He said that he has a requirement if a teacher severs the employment contract, that he has a requirement to report that to the licensing office. That's not found anywhere in law. 1698, Title 16, Section 1698 spells out the reasons why teachers can be reported for a licensing action, and there is no such requirement or language in there. He's reading some language into that section of law that's just simply not found in words. I understand that that's what the superintendents believe. I'm not arguing that he doesn't believe that, but it's not found in law. With regard to the discipline teachers for testifying before you, the legislature or State Board of Education, I think we heard from multiple folks yesterday who said that they would never do that. Well, then it shouldn't be offensive to put that in a statutory construct then, I would submit to you. There are free speech issues here. The US Supreme Court in Garcetti about 10 or 15 years ago said, public employees do not enjoy an unfettered right of free speech. And so when they're employees, I think this language would protect teachers who wanted to come before the state bodies, policymakers, and have the conversations with you that you want to hear. We want to hear, as Sue pointed out, Zaglowski pointed out, boots on the ground. Well, if people are fearful of coming to testify for you, there's a reason why they're not here. I'm representing the 13,000 members of Vermont NEA because they can't be here. A, they're in class, and B, some people are fearful of being here. And we're trying to get a couple teachers. We don't want to inundate you with a parade of witnesses. We don't think that's helpful to you in your consideration, but certainly one or two teachers who have gone through the experience of having difficulty trying to find a new job. You should hear from those, in fact, boots on the ground. And we're trying to get you a couple of those folks. And the extensions that they talked about yesterday, those are very subjectively granted. When the job market was tighter, certainly certain teachers got extensions routinely. I would say science and math teachers were routinely granted extensions because the school wanted to retain them as much as they possibly could, so they would bend over backwards. So there was subjectivity here. That may not be the case today, but it may be tomorrow at some point in the future. And we want to protect all teachers to make sure that they have that ability to interview and get a new job, perhaps, if it makes sense for them and their family. And this bill would just merely establish a floor. Schools could go above and beyond it. I shared with Daphne a flow chart document to talk about the hiring season, if you will. Several of the superintendents yesterday talked about it. and address it as they will. The reality is there's a contract, master agreement, collective bargaining agreement that governs the terms and conditions of employment. There's also the statutory overlay. And the statute says that all contracts for the next school year shall be issued on or before April 15. And most, in fact, are issued on or before April 15. Most schools have about allow for 2 weeks to return that contract. Some will offer a longer period of time, no question about it. But for the most part, it's about a 2-week turnaround. Teachers sign those on or before approximately May 1. That's when schools then know that this teacher or that teacher is not returning next school year. That's when the hiring season begins. So when a teacher in that 2-week period, when she has her contract for the next year, it's really not known what positions are available for the next school year because the contracts are all out, essentially. So it's after May 1 when schools know that, oh, I need a fourth grade teacher for the next school year, or a science teacher in the high school for the next year. That's when the schools know, and that's when they then begin to post, we need a fourth grade teacher for the next school year. And that's when teachers begin to look. Well, if what they're saying, the superintendents are saying, if you're under a contract, and at that point you are for the next school year, you cannot, by their own, timeline provisions here, and the way they interpret it, you can't look for another job without their permission at any time. Essentially, that's true. That's how it's been operating. That's our beef. That's our concern, and why we're trying to make a change to the law to provide a hiring season that does allow schools who have a vacancy in the fourth grade, perhaps, to look around and find the best qualified person. And it may be a person who's teaching in another school district in the state of Vermont. And that's simply unfair to the school that has a vacancy and the teacher who may want that to fill that vacancy. And that's the process here. What going to June 15 would allow people a reasonable amount of time, both schools and teachers, to sort out what positions are available, who's available to take those, and then move ahead with a hiring during that season. Certainly, we don't want to see somebody leave a job the day before classes begin in August. That's not helpful to the school. It's not helpful, and we're not here supporting that notion. New York, I believe, has a similar. You can change your contract anytime you want. This bill, and it's a compromise already. And I'm not sure we didn't come in seeking June 15, but Senator Perchlik, in his wisdom, thought that was the right date, and I respect that. It may not be where I want to be, but it does allow for a modest hiring season in statute for folks to look around. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Fannin. And Mr. Tucker was saying yesterday, and it really stuck with me, that this is raised year after year after year, and I really prefer not to, and it's going to be raised. So this committee generally doesn't want to punt things to future legislatures. Honestly, I feel like we would rather deal with this. I would personally rather deal with this year and get this work done rather than to, as he said, every year get everybody upset, take time for testimony. I personally, where I'm sitting, I'm hoping we can do something. Questions or comments for Mr. Fannin?
If I may, Senator Campion, respond to that, because I think that, with all fairness, the horse hasn't been. I think the argument Mark Tucker made yesterday is that we've beaten this dead horse, and in fact, let me give, if I may, some brief history on this. The bill.
It's going to really have to be brief because we do have the secretary here. We have a public hearing this evening.
That's fine.
Okay.
All right, I'll be very brief. There have been two hearings on this subject. One in February of 2020. Well, in March of 2020, the pandemic hit. No more hearings took place. And the next hearing on this is your hearing today, or yesterday and today, the ongoing. There have been 2 hearings on it. Yes, there have been bills circulating, but only 2 hearings on it. So with all due respect, we haven't had a full airing of the issue, I would say.
Well, my point is I'd rather have it aired now and be done with it, and this committee act on it rather than year after year it be brought up.
Thank you. I would agree with that too.
Senator Perchlik.
No, I can't remember. It was just a point. So, I was just going to ask about the June 15th date. What we heard some argument that that's now getting, for the few teachers that this would impact, that trying to hire teachers in June, they can't do classroom instruction. I mean, you heard those comments too, if you heard the testimony. So I didn't know, if you had a reaction to their comments that that's too late because school is almost out or already out.
Well, I think that I understand the argument. I think that certainly that's the end date, and contracts are, if they're due back May 1, schools are quite capable of hiring, or excuse me, interviewing people in May and doing that mock teaching, I guess, interview, if that's the way they want to do it. And I think that's, you got to have some date. Certainly most schools by mid-June are looking to wrap up, but most schools are not finished by June 15.
Okay. Mr. Fenner, we're going to have to leave it there for now. This is very
Thank
helpful.
you.
We're going to take it up a little bit more next week as well. Then we have a little time before we leave for break. But thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Secretary French, sorry to keep you waiting. We, as I hope you heard from our committee assistant, we're just going to have you talk a little bit right now about S283, miscellaneous changes to education. And so with that, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dan French, Secretary of Education. I have a copy of the recent draft of this. I think I'll just go through it in the order. I don't have written testimony for you. I assume the committee's got this up in front of them, or?
I can only speak for myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, section 1 I don't have any commentary on that. It's Community
Okay.
College of Vermont. Section 2, suspension or expulsion of students. It seems like I would argue a technical correction to expand it to include the private programs. That's something I would support. Our team is prepared to offer that technical support to implement that. We think that's a prudent change in policy. Section 3 is the report and recommendations for the impact of standardizing the entrance age of pre-K. And section 4 also has a report, a mechanism, kind of related topic on uniform school calendar. Yeah, I think notwithstanding the policy merits of either one of these, the idea of going to report, I would just comment that neither of these policies would be perceived as us as being a priority relative to recovery work. So we certainly, could do some sort of report on this, but it would be a very short report. I will observe that some of the reports we provided to the General Assembly this year were 1-page long reports. Yep. I'm not, just to further get into that, I'm not sure what we would find under section 3 of the report on modifying that. We'd get some feedback, some anecdotal observations, so forth from the stakeholder groups, but we could certainly summarize that in the report. I guess I'm trying to give you a flavor of what the report would likely yield.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
The section 4 report, statewide uniform school calendar. I think I've commented previously. The low point in my career to date was having been sentenced or to serve on the statewide school calendar committee. That was established in statute, created a committee that was required, I believe, to hold 5 public hearings around the state to identify the perfect school calendar, and then report back to the General Assembly. We were unable to identify a perfect calendar. And I was one of the people that was asked to testify on behalf of the group to bring that bad message back. So certainly we could do that analysis. You just alert again, there's not much consensus on this issue. Yeah. If there were some specific policy goal you were trying to achieve, I mean, it's certainly from my perspective been highlighted as a result of the pandemic in terms of organizing our public health response, that there might be some greater administrative convenience by having a uniform calendar, but it's not clear to me what the committee would be looking at for policy goals from that. But certainly, again, I think, my theme would be on both section 3 and 4, those reports would be fairly nominal. Again, it's not going to be a priority relative to the recovery work, but it's something we could do, but it would be very limited. Section 5, on the other hand, the remote learning policy, I think this is a very good idea. I think, I've to a certain extent been dissatisfied with our ability to examine some of the opportunities we've had from the pandemic, because, the pandemic isn't over. And, the remote learning one is, I did commission a task force at one point to identify new opportunities we learned after the first year of our pandemic. And we've had some discussion of remote learning, and certainly our investments in Vermont Virtual Learning Cooperative and so forth. But I can't help to think that we need to do more in this space. So I think a report would be useful. In particular, as we contemplate expanding learning opportunities for small schools, some of the staffing pressures that we'll be experiencing. I think we need to be more aggressive as a state in exploring how remote learning would function, both from a quality and equity standpoint in our portfolio, if you will, of options for students. I don't think we've had the space to do that analysis. So I think this report would, if nothing else, put a bookmark out there for us to achieve some sort of impetus to study this in more detail. So I would welcome the opportunity to do that analysis. And I would also mention we're in the process of going back through our recovery planning relative to our ARP-ESSER state plan. The General Assembly did earmark some funding for remote learning for us. So we would also have the ability, I think, under that funding to commission or contract out a more thorough analysis and review of what are some of the other policy approaches we're seeing around the country, for example, and how we might modify our statutory framework or regulations to support remote learning of a high quality nature in Vermont. So there's an opportunity there from a funding perspective as well. I think that's it in the bill.
Questions for Secretary French? Secretary, I should say, we're still kind of making our way through this. We're trying to put as much as we can possibly think of into this, and then we'll start to kind of pull out,
Sure.
kind of as we hear from witnesses and others. Senator Perschlick.
I know we're short on time, but maybe it's just a placeholder to talk about the calendar issue. I know you've testified before, Secretary French, on the history, but I think that history was, at least for the members of the Education Committee, it was before when we were on the Education Committee. So basically, my thought is, like, if you had the power to set it, would that solve it, or does that not solve it? Kind of.
The question is, what is the it we're trying to solve? And I think that's the question. I think, there's a couple things that come to mind immediately, and one has to do with CTE center access, which is a theme of other policy initiatives we have in play right now. We are, one of our primary lenses is looking at barriers that prevent students from accessing CTE centers. And that is a challenge right now in various regions, because, in the case of Rutland, for example, they have 12 sending different high schools, and they tried, and I've sat in those meetings trying to coordinate those calendars on a regional basis. The challenge is not all those districts are in the same regions or in multiple CTE center regions. We have students going lots of different directions. So one advantage of having a single calendar would be to facilitate easier student access to CTE centers. So I think, to your point, we should identify what those policy goals are. And I think, from the pandemic, we certainly realized it would be convenient to be able to have greater oversight of the calendar for a number of reasons. To what extent the operating conditions would support that approach going forward is a good question. And there's always been the argument of, well, we could coordinate state level professional development and things like that, but I don't know to what extent that's true or not. But there's a lot of inconsistency in how calendars are being implemented. So, if you want to carve out some time for that, I'd be happy to share, lessons learned and some observations that I've seen over the years.
Senator Chittenden.
Secretary French, I wouldn't call it the low point of my career, but at the University of Vermont, I was involved in the faculty senate for 10 years, and I have a lot of scars from leading academic calendar conversations, spearheading that effort. So I definitely get that people take it for granted, and it is no small thing to consider such a topic. I just do think it was well worth the conversations to be had. So I'm glad you're not opposed to us taking this up again. I think it's worth considering and evaluating how we have our calendar structured throughout the state.
Yeah, and in the spirit of, part of, I think, my responsibility as secretary is to surface issues that we found as a result of, on an ongoing basis. And I think particularly with the pandemic, we identify the calendar as a structural issue. And that's why I brought it forward previously for you to look at with sort of a new lens.
Well, if we decide to come up with another committee to look at it, we know who the chair will be.
I will quickly delegate that to.
Any other comments or questions for Mr. French, Secretary French at this point? Okay, Mr. Secretary, thanks very much for coming in. We appreciate it. I think we're going to see you a couple times next week. So,
all right, thank you. Have a good night.
Appreciate it. Thanks, you too. Ms. Greaves, am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can. Maybe turn it up just a little bit. If, is that
Okay.
possible?
I think I have it all the way up.
That's perfect. You're great.
Okay.
You're great. Committee, I wanted to get a sense of what was happening on the ground with COVID and the transition from the agency guidelines around contact tracing in our schools. I reached out to a couple of nurses. I'm grateful that Ms. Greaves was available to come in and talk to us a little bit today. So with that, Ms. Greaves, welcome to Senate Education. I believe this is your first time in the committee. We understand you're at Hardwick Elementary School, and we thought we would just hear a little bit from you on what you're seeing, how it's going. You have all had an incredibly heavy lift this year. We greatly appreciate all that you're doing, and curious if the shift around contact tracings helped, and then any other just observations that you think we should know as policymakers.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate you asking me to be here today. My name is Anna Greaves. I'm a registered nurse here at Hardwick Elementary, and I am a nurse employee here at Orleans Southwest Supervisory Union. First of all, this year has been incredibly challenging, and I know that that's not news to anybody, but I did want to spend a few minutes just talking about that challenge before I go into the changes that have been made in the last month, because I think that's really important that I share with you about the challenges. The pandemic has been 2+ years now. This is my first year as a school nurse. I worked in healthcare in other areas prior to being a school nurse. And I will say I was very shocked to be faced with what we were faced with this year. And it put a lot of challenges in front of me. And I'm incredibly thankful for the team on the ground here in our district and at our school to work through those challenges, because I did not foresee them coming. Those team members here, our principal, our staff, our COVID team throughout the district, and our group of nurses have been incredible to work with, and we've worked together so well to face these challenges every single day as they come flying at us, as policies change, guidelines change, numbers and cases go up. It's been an adventure, and we couldn't do it. We couldn't have kept these schools open in a safe and healthy environment without the team here. And I think most school districts would agree with me that it's the people on the ground that have made it bearable and have provided our students with a safe environment to learn in. So I think, things came to a head really right before winter break, before those holidays. Delta, Omicron was coming into play here. When we got back from winter break, it was very challenging. We were faced with so many cases, new CDC guidelines that we hadn't then dealt with at a state level. We had a gap of guidance, essentially. We had old guidelines, new CDC guidelines, and this big space in between left with a lot of unknowns. And that put on January 2nd, I believe, or 3rd is the day we came back, that put a lot of strain on our school community. And that was challenging. Ultimately, it challenged our families and our students. And that was really, really hard to see. I empathize with those families every single time I picked up that phone and had 30-minute conversations with them because they were confused. I was confused. It was hard. And I just, every phone conversation was different, but the same. It was, I have a sick child. I'm trying to keep my family healthy. I have no more days off from work. I don't understand these guidelines. Are you going to tell their teacher that they have schoolwork to do? What do we do? When can they come back? How do I get tested? There's no testing slots. I could go on and on and on, but that was very, very challenging. So for 2+ weeks after we got back from break, we faced the highest numbers of COVID that we had ever seen in our district. And we hadn't really received any changing guidelines from the state at that point. We'd had a few speak hereof changes, but essentially as a district, we created a new guideline from where we were looking at the new CDC guidelines and kind of bridging the gap between. We had reached out at our local level in the Morrisville state office, and they helped us kind of create those guidelines, but we were working blind with the new, with that new CDC guideline versus what we had from the state prior to break. And that was an incredibly challenging period of time. And I know that it takes a lot of time to build those new protocols and the new flow sheets. And those 2.5 weeks, pushing 3 weeks prior to getting that in place from the state was probably the 3 hardest weeks of this year. So I think that really pushed us all. You know, there were days where all we were doing was on the phone with families, and we're on the phone in our offices and a child comes to the door. They might have a paper cut. They might have whatever need they have. That second grader should receive all of my attention as their school nurse. I'm here for them, but they see me on the phone and I'm doing a very important job as well, but I can't care for that second grader with a paper cut. And that, as a nurse, ripped my heart out. And that was really, really hard. And I think it's important that you hear that from the point where you are, and those little things really make a difference in the eyes of our students and the future members of our community. And so I really remember that I'm here for them. And there were some days that I couldn't meet their needs because we all were swamped with COVID needs that really are beyond our job description. And that was that has been really, really hard to work through. And I'll transition into how we're doing now, but I really just wanted to share some of those experiences because I think it's really important. There were days when we feel like we didn't have the time, the resources, the information, or the guidance that we needed to answer all the families' questions, meet all of their needs, supply staff with the answers that they needed and deserved to get. And it was really, really challenging. When the state provided us with the change in guidelines and we quote unquote dropped contact tracing, really contact tracing morphed into what it is now, that was a shift. We still had high numbers, some of the highest numbers we'd had, but there was, light at the end of the tunnel. We still had to contact trace, especially in those high school classrooms where they're not in one room all day long. We still had to follow that student through their day and notify those broad groups of students, whether it be basketball or a drama club or their reading group. We still had to quote unquote trace them. We did end up calling them presumptive contacts, but not close contacts. And that still took time. And it wasn't a complete elimination of contact tracing. That being said, we still had the piece where a parent calls, their child is COVID positive. We spend 20 minutes on the phone with them going through the timeline. Well, they can test out on day 4 and 5, if and when, all the scenarios. Now, what do we do with their brother and sister in the home? Are they vaccinated? Are they not? Dad just tested positive. There's a lot of moving pieces and parts, and that takes a lot of time still. And we're here to do that. And we will continue to be here to do that and provide that resource for families, but it does still take a lot of time at which we're not spending with students in our buildings. and caring for them and their present needs. I am very thankful that the supply of rapid antigen tests has been what it has. I know we have had access to the tests that we need, and I'm thankful for that. That has allowed families to test and to keep their children as safe as they choose with however they test them, and having that power back into the hands of the families to test as they see fit based on the recommendations has been really good. And I'm thankful for the number of tests we've had provided to us from the state.
So I'm going to interrupt there
Yeah.
because we only have maybe about 5 minutes because I want to get some questions and answers going. So you have enough tests right now? You feel as though parents have tests, feeling that's adequate, and you have enough also at the school?
Yeah, we did a count here in our district, I believe Monday or Tuesday this week. And we felt that with the cases sustaining at the numbers that they are this week, we have enough, I believe, through the end of this week, maybe through the end of next week, to provide whether it's the 2 tests for vaccinated or the 5 tests for unvaccinated individuals post-contact. That being said, you also have we're providing those to individuals with symptoms, so that increases your numbers in need. I believe we're in a good place right now, but if we had another large surge, we would definitely deplete our pile of tests.
How and can you tell us whether you're in a rural part of the state?
Yes.
We recognize that. Are parents picking up the tests? In other words, is the testing happening at home that you would expect, or is it kind of 50-50? I can tell just by your it's hard to say.
Very hard to say.
Okay.
We have been instructed by the state not to probe and follow up. Like, did you receive the test? Did you take it? Send us a picture. We were instructed not to do that.
Okay.
So we don't keep record. We do have, a list, so-and-so's mom said send 2 home in the backpack.
Okay.
We have that. And in the recent days, we've seen less being requested by the families, but we've also sent many home with a few extra in earlier circumstances. Or if there's a large family, we had a few boxes of 10, we would send the family home with 10. I've had family members say that they've received a few from the state when the state emailed out the say yes to tests or whatever that was, saying they received a few there. But in the last week or so, the requests have come down a little, but we've also had a lot of people have already gotten COVID.
And you're K through 6, correct?
This school, Hardwick Elementary, is in Hardwick, Vermont. It's pre-K is in our building as well, but K through 6. And then I work in a district where, of course, there's high schools, and we all work together as a nursing team.
Okay. Questions, additional questions from Ms. Greaves or comments? We're trying to just, again, get that sense of what's happening on the ground by inviting different people in. Senator Hooker.
Just curious, Ms. Greaves, how have your numbers been at school since the testing has been shifted to home?
I think that they've gone up. I don't have the data in front of me. I'm sorry that I didn't prepare that, but we've seen post-break, winter break, a steady number. I will say last week in one of our high schools, it was a high school, elementary school combination. There were over 20 cases. This week in another high school, there will be over 20 cases. Our small school of just over 200 kids was over 20 cases the week prior. And for our district per week, seems like a very high number for us and sustainability of kind of managing staffing and all that. So it seems like it takes its turn in the communities.
Do you travel to other schools? Or are you there at Hardwick Elementary?
The nurses in our district are employees of the district, so we can work at any of the schools. I'm primarily here at Hardwick Elementary, but at a drop of a hat, I could go to any of the schools, as I did today for an emergency up at the high school. So we all are working together.
And are you also seeing right now flu, bad colds, other things in addition to COVID?
Yep.
Okay.
We are seeing other community illnesses. I don't know what percentage of them are flu, but we are seeing, especially at the elementary level, the strep throat, ear infections, community illness, cold going around.
Okay. But this shift on contact tracing, I mean, we had heard that there are lines out of nurses, from nurses' office going, stretching down hallways in different schools. That has stopped, correct? I mean, it feels, tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but it feels like things have been a little bit relieved through this new contact tracing process.
Yes. The change from the less contact tracing that we're doing now, paired with the ability to return to school with rapid tests, not PCR tests, paired with parents having the tests at home and higher accessibility to the tests. I think all of that has allowed kids to remain in school and students to remain here, and it has reduced the strain on school nurses. That being said, I don't feel like it's 50% of what it was. There are days where it's still quite challenging, but I do have days where I get to do my job. I get to do school nursing tasks, and that really, really excites me.
Any other questions or comments from Ms. Greaves at this point? We really are grateful for everything that you're doing. We know you are right on the front lines, and we also appreciate you sharing this with us as we are hearing from the agency and the Department of Health next week on an update. And it's just good to hear directly from from nurses themselves. So we really appreciate it. Also, please always feel free to reach out to us as you may have questions or concerns as we move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate you coming in. Okay.